Let's see here. Pokemon Go. Get mic on you here. You know, I grew up in Wickenburg, Arizona. You ever been there?
Where?
Wickenburg, Arizona.
No.
It's a little bitty old gold mining town on the Lion River. About 45 miles south of Scottsdale, right outside of Phoenix.
No, my mom moved to Lake Havasu. That's about the only
Yeah,
place
Lake
I've
Havasu
been
is
there.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
Extremely gorgeous. And yeah, Wickenburg, I wish something missing. It was a super small town. Yeah, I love the Southwest, you know, the air, you never had any allergy problems.
And you ended up here.
Yeah, you know, I went to school in Kentucky. I went to school at Western Kentucky.
Uh-huh.
And I started working at Moorhead, 9 years ago.
And you didn't hear about the Rock?
No.
And you
I
were
did
in
not.
Moore. That's hard to believe because it was everywhere, wasn't it?
Moorhead's media is Lexington media.
Okay.
And our newspapers are from Lexington.
Everything goes through.
And the Independent didn't reach up there. We didn't get WSXE channels either.
Okay.
So I'm sure they covered it.
You missed a couple snippets of it,
It's
probably.
like 18 minutes UK basketball and maybe 30 seconds about the Rock. And you get, not to rip on UK basketball, but you just get kind of tired of hearing about it on the Lexington television stations.
That's what sells.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. That, horses and bourbon. So. All right, Randy, let's get started here. So start out with, tell us your name and where you grew up.
My name is Randy Nichols, and I grew up right here in Portsmouth, born and raised in Portsmouth, Ohio.
So how did you become interested in the local histories of Portsmouth and the Mississippi Valley and the river?
Oh, we got a tremendous heritage here, and there's a wonderful history here in Portsmouth. With the murals, really has brought it to life for me. I got involved with the baseball history, and I, from there, got involved with the baseball murals banquet we do every year as a fundraiser for the murals. But how I happened upon the Indian Head Rock was I was at a local copy store, the Copies Galore, and I was getting some copies made, probably of the baseball stuff actually, and she had an old postcard laying there with the picture of the Rock on it. And I asked her, what is this? And she told me that they had supposedly found it and pulled it up on the bank, and it's over on the riverbank. I'm like, you got to be kidding me, you know? So sure enough, I get a copy of that picture, and off I go. And there's this big old object covered with tarps and straps on a trailer sitting over there. And I pulled the tarp back and looked at the image of the Indian head and the house, and gosh, I just couldn't get enough of it from there. You know, I started researching it, went to the library, there was a file, started learning the story of it, then realized that there was a group involved with maybe maintaining it and putting it on display or something. I kind of got involved with that.
What are some of the histories of the Rock that you read about? Like, what was kind of the Rock's, didn't have a purpose? Why did people actually carve their names on it? Did you ever find anything like that?
Well, I've read most everything out there, I think, at one time or another, and I formed opinions. My understanding of it, it was quite an event when this thing would appear. And you could imagine, and we didn't have Facebook, but it was spread through the community. The Rock's up. Grandma talked about that, or Uncle Bill talked about that, and I've heard of it. And they said it's sticking up now because the water level's down. We're in a drought. They said it would happen about every 10 years. And they would get on their Sunday best and go down there, and the papers will tell you at one point there was like 1,000 people down there on the banks of the Ohio River peering across looking at this rock. They would wear their best. There's photos of them in their Sunday attire, and the adventurous would somehow make their way out into the river, which was probably more than 2/3 across the river, and take tools and chisel their name on it. And there's one account of Ford that actually as a young man, rode a log across. Of course, the river would have been much narrower because we were in a drought. We didn't have the locks and dams and that such. So it would have been quite a bit smaller, and not so. The flow would have been somewhat, limited. But they said he rode a log out and back, and the paper says that he become one of our leaders in our area. Ford was the last name. There's another prominent name is Kenny, and that's all throughout our history. There's a large family plot in Greenlawn Cemetery, the Kenny family. We have an avenue lane that's named after the Kennys, and but that's what I take away, that it was quite an event. And you know, through the locks and dams and it disappearing, it had been lost in our generation. I'd never heard of it. I was born in 1962. I was probably 40, in my early 40s when I heard about it, and all my brothers had never heard about it. I mentioned it to my father, who was born in the 30s, and sure enough, Dad had heard about it. Of course, he had never seen it, but the story was getting lost in our generation.
Yeah, and it's some cool stuff, like the little Johnny book, supposedly carved his initials and went on to fight in the Battle of Shiloh, and things like that.
Some folklore, some of it's
Yeah.
probably true, and some of it's...
There was, I found some kind of article somewhere that it could even be a riverboat pirate signal or something. So it had interest to it, and there was a guy who did panoramics of the Mississippi Valley, and had it painted as a giant head.
We got a picture of it
Yeah.
for you. We got a picture of it.
Like almost like an Easter Island type head coming up.
Yeah, the legend had grown and it got bigger than it truly was, right?
A face like
Yeah.
this giant head. Did you ever find out who the lady was that was standing on the rock?
No, there's been speculation. I forgot who. They had brought it back to a family, a prominent family, and I was just talking to Linda Donaldson at Copies Galore, and we had that conversation. I can't remember who it was, but that was an old postcard, and that kind of attests to how they would dress up. It was a big event. It was pretty cool.
So who was Bannon, and what role did Bannon have in originally documenting the rock?
There was the Bannons were a prominent family in our history. Most of them were lawyers. One of them in particular was a lawyer for the railroad. And we have right now Bannon Park, which is in the north end of town. And right above Bannon Park, they owned the old monastery, and it was quite an estate. They were pretty wealthy. And there was 3 brothers who put their initials on there as I believe, teenagers. And the great story was Town Bannon came back from California to see the rock when Steve called him, and Town was excited that Steve had found this rock because he had heard stories of it. Town was quite older, and he come back, and we were down at the garage, and he went over and put his fingers in the initials of his great grandfather, I believe it was, and his brothers. It was the 3 brothers. Great story, and Town was just excited and thrilled to see this Indian Head rock. He's come back twice, and we enjoyed. Matter of fact, if you got time to go to the library, I took him and his cousin over there, and they told the story, and it's on DVD over there in the history at the library. If you ask for Town Bannon's video.
Is he still alive now?
Yes, Steve told him about you,
Okay.
and he was thrilled. He wrote, I've got a copy of his letter to the editor. Do you remember that, Rick, when he wrote the letter to the editor? And he addressed it as the DNA of Portsmouth was on that rock. And he wrote a really good article.
See if I can contact him.
Oh, he's a great character. And, man, the story has a great memory. We probably haven't seen him for like 10 years, so I'm not sure of his health because he was probably in his 70s then. But he tells the whole story. Oh, the great story about the Bannons is the book that Steve read as a teenager in Ironton High School, and I'm sure he told you the story. But in that book the Bannons wrote, there's a story that the rock was going to disappear under the surface of the water for the last time because of the locks and dams. And there was a dam downstream that had broken, and they were repairing it. And even as they were there, the water was rising, and they had a motorboat, and I believe this was in the 20s, And they went out there in this motorboat and rapidly, as fast as they could, go around this rock that created a wake, and it pulled the water away from the rock, and they snapped the very first picture of the Indian head face, as we call it. And that was the very first picture. And then the dam, of course, was fixed. The water rose up, covered the rock, and it was never to be seen again until Steve Schaefer found it.
So who carved the face, the famed face on the rock? Did you guys ever figure that out?
No. It's been linked to the Native Americans, but if you research it and check with the authorities of the images of Native American, they'll tell you they've never seen it in such a round figure. It looks like Charlie Brown. I mean, I never once believed it was of an Indian, the features or anything. It's just...
How do you think it got the name Indian Head Rock? Just because it was a face?
Yeah, I don't know. You're talking mid-1800s, I think, was some of the earliest newspaper accounts of it. And thing was, secondhand information, and the story was told there was a face on it, and before it was over with, it was an Indian face, and or pirates, and it just kind of went from there. The image of the home is very interesting, and there's a stone house out on the west side that still exists, and I've always wondered if that could have been that, because that house would have been back from that time period. And we refer to it as the stone house, actually, and it's still there.
Yeah, that's actually when I saw the rock. It was, other than the face, the house was actually really cool to see. Was the rock more of a historical item to Portsmouth or Greenup or South Shore, Kentucky?
In my readings, I understand that there was some accounts that it was used for navigational purposes on the river. But back in the day, the newspapers, celebrated it. It was referred to as the Portsmouth Indian Head Rock. I understand that bank line of Kentucky wasn't developed much in the turn of in the mid 1800s, but Portsmouth, of course, was. I've not read any documentation where it is very close to them. I mean, in proportion to what our people had to go across to. And I've always scanned the photos to look over on the bank line and to see how it was developed, if there was any homes or anything back in that time period. But I'm convinced that the settlement and the population was on this side, on the northern side of the Ohio River, and we celebrated it. Our ancestors' names are on it, Kenny and Ford and Luther, and there's no documentation I know of that there's any Kentucky names on the rock.
Yeah, I found some stuff that actually referred to it as Portsmouth Indian Head Rock.
Oh, sure.
Several times.
Oh, yeah, in the newspapers. That's in the old postcards. There was a gentleman, gosh, I've forgotten his name, but he did postcards of a lot of the historical things of our area, and he had three different postcards of the Indian Head Rock. It was celebrated, certainly.
So what was your first thoughts of Mr. Steve Schaefer when you found out about the guys getting it out of the river?
I kept learning about it. Initially, I thought a bunch of yahoos went over and grabbed hold of the rock and pulled it out. But then I started learning about it. Man, they'd found it like 4 years before they pulled it out. And they'd looked for it a couple years prior to that. So I started thinking about it. They'd spent thousands of dollars on this project. Hot summers and using oxygen tanks and trying to figure it out, and they were failures for a long time, but they kept going back and finally located it. And then somebody said, "Hey, why don't we try to get it out?" And then how are you going to, I don't know how heavy they've estimated the tonnage of it, and they come up with this idea of blowing up barrels, and what a great coming together of minds and resources, and I applaud them just in that, and at one point I understood that they were so close to getting it to lift, and they went to Columbus and got additional equipment and tried that, and they were about to quit, and somebody underneath was on. They had audible sound, and somebody said, "I felt it move." And they kept going, and sure enough, there she went, and she come to the surface. And gosh, I mean, I bet they were just ecstatic, and to float it, just the concept of getting, and then finding a crane, and I think the guy should have been celebrated, contrary to what actually happened when they did.
These cards can only hold so much before they stop. All right, so how soon after you saw The Rock for the first time did all the legal stuff start?
As my memory serves me, it was pretty soon after that it started. And I was thinking about this today. To me, it was kind of like the Rocky movie where Rocky gets in the ring with the wrestler, Thunder Lips. And Rocky's like, let's play this up, and this is good. This is good for everybody. Everybody's going to win. But Thunder Lips grabs Rocky and tries to throw him out of the ring. And I felt like that's what happened. We celebrate Kentucky, man, and we're not in another country. We got Jesse Stewart on our murals. We've got Don Gullett, the professional baseball player, comes to our banquet. And we've got him painted on our murals. So we celebrate. We're one and the same. And then the next thing you know, it was us and them and you guys and you cowboys and thieves and whoa, who are they talking about? So that's when I took my liberty and did the Indian Head Rock song, We Will Rock You, and did a video and had some fun with it. And I don't know if I helped the cause or set us back, but that's how I met Steve Schaefer. That video led to Steve Schaefer.
And one of the things I was telling the mayor in here earlier was I've talked to Cliff Duvall, the judge executive in Greenup, and they're pretty laid back about it now. And of course, Cliff Duvall's retired now. The judge, he said he's serving out his last couple of years. But I talked to Jack Conway.
Yeah, these names are all coming back to
Attorney
me.
General at that time
Okay.
in Kentucky. He ran a failed bid for United States Senate and lost to Rand Paul. He ran unsuccessfully for governor and lost to Matt Bevin, so he's had political runs. But he was still supercharged about the rock. And some of the other politicians, Diane Comer at the Heritage Council, were still supercharged about it.
Interesting.
But what I was telling the mayor was the folks here in the part of Kentucky that live around and know this region, they were pretty laid back about it. But the Frankfort and Louisville politicians and lawmakers were still, and Louisville and Frankfort's a long way from this region. And that's what I find interesting, that it could have been worked out between these two towns and communities, but it got to...
Yeah, they didn't have a dog in the fight, did they? The state officials didn't have a dog in the fight, and if they'd have left it to the locals, we knew what to do with it, and we could have worked it out, and it would have been a great win for our area, certainly.
Yeah, and then, the news media, Randy Yohe had the first story where it was the war between the states. And, of course, WCZ-TV had a lot of news coverage of it. NPR, National Public Radio, did a feature.
Sure. I remember when they
Steve
came to
Hartman
town.
came and did a piece. So yeah, it took on a life of its own. And then through it all, Steve was looking at 7 years of federal prison time.
4th degree felony.
And through it all, finally the charges were all dropped, and Rock was taken over to Greenup. But what was your thoughts on after the trial was over?
Through the video, I got to meet Steve Schaefer. Didn't know him from Adam. We just really hit it off and become really good friends. He's one of my best friends to this day. And matter of fact, today I asked him if he'd be one of my pallbearers, and he made me agree he would if I would sing at his funeral. So that's Steve and I's relationship. But Steve, we had some serious conversations in those dark days. Things were pretty scary, and he had a lot of people, surprisingly, I don't want to speak for Steve, but his attorney, when they started, oh, we're going to give them the business. You know, they have nothing to stand on. We got, you know, X, Y, and Z. Don't you worry. And we started getting closer and closer. And they're like, Steve, you know, they're going to offer you a plea deal, and I'm advising you to take it. You give this public apology, you know, that you did steal it, and you're sorry, and pay this $5,000 fine or whatever. And Steve would talk to me, man, and he'd say, Randy, I can't do it. He said, I didn't have ill intentions. I meant well. There was no conspiracy to profit from it. And man, he stood true to his word, and his integrity, certainly shone at the end. He had people all around him say, Steve, you need to do this, take it. And he was looking at prison time, but just the man of integrity that he is, he said, no, I'm going to go before the judge. The judge at one point turned to his lawyer at one of the proceedings and said, have you made it clear to your client that he's looking at jail? Yes, sir. I've told him, Your Honor. I've told him. But Steve, he wouldn't budge, buddy. He stuck to his guns. And then, lo and behold, they said they didn't know if it was actually the correct rock that they were mentioning, and they wouldn't be able to prove that, so thus they threw the whole case out.
It's amazing to me, though, that you would levy 7-year federal charges and drop the charges, you know. It's crazy.
What does that say?
Yeah. So, did you know that the rock ended up in that county garage?
I didn't know where it was. Really
did that
just
surprise you? Was it kind of sad?
I kind of figured, you know, I didn't, you know, economically, both of our communities are struggling, and I wouldn't have thought their small community wouldn't be able to have the tax revenue to do something with it. I couldn't understand why it would go to the Capitol. There was no purpose or connection, no ties to that. So it really wasn't a Kentucky story. It was a local, you know, community story, and so I didn't expect it to go anywhere. No, I kind of, you know, imagined that it could end up like this.
That's what the judge executive over there told me, that kind of after the dust settled, they were kind of stuck with it. Greenville County.
Yeah.
And, you know, what do? You know, the state of Kentucky, you know, has all this power, and, you know, kind of now it's all on you. Okay, see ya. You know?
I could imagine them looking at each other and saying, holy crap, what are we going to do with it? Now we got it, you know, like a dog chasing a truck, and when it catches it, what's he do with it?
And the judge, Bobby Carpenter was his name, and I don't know if you guys know him or not. Real nice guy.
I know the name, but
real Southern guy, you know. And so what he told me, he said that he'd like to find it a home before this term is up.
That's interesting choice of words. Find it a home.
He said a place where people could appreciate it.
Sure.
You know, and I was telling the mayor was kind of hoping it would come back over here. But my thought is, if the people still in power, they try to get to Frankfurt or something before they would probably let it come back. But it'd be really neat if it did come back.
Yeah.
To the region somehow.
We had some people in place, and there was several leaders of the community that were involved. We offered to place signage that would say it's on loan from Kentucky, give them credit for it. They've loaned it to us, talked about building a little annex onto the Welcome Center where we're filming this, and it could have been a glass enclosure, so when people were visiting the murals, they could walk over and see the Indian Head Rock through the glass. You know, it wouldn't even have to be open for them to come in to see it. There was all kinds of options, but you know, I don't know if all those options are gone. Let's kill this. But I told Steve, I said, the rock seems to appear and disappears for 100 years, and it shows its face again, and now it's disappeared again, and I'm not sure the last chapter's been written. I wouldn't be surprised if calmer heads, prevail, and there could be something done with it. There's something to be said.
Did the city of Portsmouth embrace the rock pretty well? You talked about the Rock Fest and all of that.
Yeah, they did initially, but then the story got old, and then it was a punchline to a joke, then to a lot of people. I had so much respect for it in the story and the Bannons and, our heritage, but it did become, there was so much coverage. It was on the radio and the news, and it became a joke, I think, even with the locals to a percentage. But I don't know that they knew all the story of it, and how far it went back. And we tried earnestly to share information, to share the knowledge of it. We had a display here at the Welcome Center in one of the cases, and put documents and things and photos and the book that Steve had read as a child, and we displayed that, and we tried to educate. Education would have taken it a lot farther. I actually put a package together of all this information and just randomly mailed it to the governor of Kentucky. Just look at this, please. I want you, to see the facts. And